Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变世界
Change organizations.
Change the world.
So this paper is a little bit different from the others that we've been talking about in that it's very much an empirical paper, and it's largely concerned with measuring the degree of ethnic favoritism we find in one particular arena in one particular country. But I'm going to try to motivate it and tie the more specific findings of this more empirical paper to the broader themes of this conference, which is the impact of regime change. Okay. So transitions to democratic rule are thought to lead to a whole host of positive outcomes. Greater accountability, this is what Jeremy's study was talking about, higher rates of investment in public goods, perhaps better treatment of minorities, perhaps less civil conflict, perhaps even less corruption, or in a context where corruption tends to take the form of favoritism of particular ethnic groups that have links to political power, perhaps less ethnic favoritism. But there are all sorts of very well-known inferential problems that I won't go into, but that are there that get in the way of really trying to make strong inferences about the impact that transitions to democracy may have on these outcomes. And so there's a lot of theory out there suggesting that there may be these very positive, beneficial connections between democratization and these other outcomes across a range of sectors. But it turns out to be really hard to nail down empirically whether or not a transition to a more democratic political system has these effects. And so in the project I'm going to talk about today, which I should say is joint with Eric Cremon, who's a fellow here at Stanford this year, takes advantage of a very rich source of data to examine the impact of regime change on ethnic favoritism within Kenya and within a particular sector, and the sector is primary education. Okay? Okay. If you use the data that we're using in this project, and you look at cross-ethnic group differences in primary school achievement in Kenya throughout its history, you see some quite wide disparities. So one thing that you see is, so these are the 5 largest Kenyan ethnic groups, the most politically important groups in the country. And if you look at them and you look at the average years of primary schooling completed by members of each of these communities in the colonial era and then in each decade up through the 90s, one thing jumps out, and that is that the Kikuyu have systematically achieved higher results with respect to average years of primary schooling than members of other groups. Okay? But if you spend a little bit more time with this figure, you see something else. You see that other group, the gap between the Kikuyu and other key politically important groups like the Kalenjin and the Luo have changed over time. So for example, in the early period, the colonial era in the 1960s, you see very large gaps between educational achievement among the Kalenjin and Luo on the one hand and the Kikuyu on the other. Those gaps have narrowed significantly by the 1980s and 1990s. And so the crux of what we do empirically in this paper is try to figure out what accounts for the different average educational outcomes across these groups and the changes that we observe over time. And so what we really try to do, because we're political scientists, is to estimate the extent to which these inequalities are a product of ethnic favoritism rather than other factors. And I'll talk somewhat extensively about how we try to do that, because it's not straightforward. And then also, I'll highlight some results we have for this audience that speak to the impact of regime effects and that speak to how the extent to which ethnic favoritism takes place may vary across different institutional settings. And there's a lot of theory that suggests that it might. Okay? So what accounts for these cross-group inequalities and cross-temporal variation in the gaps across groups? Well, as I said, one possibility is ethnic favoritism by the government, and that's what we're most interested in. But in order to, we can't just take the table that I showed you earlier and infer from that it's all a product of ethnic favoritism, because there are other quite plausible alternative explanations. It could also be, for example, exposure to missionary education. When the British came to Kenya, as when other European countries came to other developing world countries, they didn't distribute things like education and health services and other kinds of public goods evenly across the population. Oftentimes they did it disproportionately in particular regions or in the homelands of particular ethnic groups, and those groups may have disproportionately benefited from that exposure to colonial investments in things like education. And those advantages from way back in the 1950s and 60s may have long-term impacts that can account for the disparities we see even to today. So we're going to want to figure out a way to control for that. It could also be that proximity to the national capital or to urban centers is causally associated with educational attainment because there are more jobs in these kinds of settings. And so if your ethnic group happens to be physically located close to the capital or close to urban settings where more jobs are, there are going to be incentives for families to invest in human capital formation, and that might account for this, quite apart from the favoritism that might play a complementary role. Okay? It also might be that income differentials across group, driven by factors that are distinct from education. We know that more education usually leads to higher incomes, but it could be that just living in a rich agricultural region or living close to trade routes gives certain groups advantages with respect to income, and that higher incomes mean, for example, that parents don't need to keep their children laboring on the farm because they have sufficient resources and they can instead withdraw their children's labor from the farms and let them attend school, and that could be what accounts for this, okay? So if we're interested in the political stuff, we need to figure out some way to control for these other things. And one of the characteristics of all of these factors that I've identified here is that they're all more or less varying by group, because they tend to be geographically or spatially oriented. And groups in places like Kenya tend to be geographically and spatially distinct from one another. And so our empirical strategy allows us to disentangle the political factors, the favoritism, from these group-specific factors, and then also to go further and to test whether the favoritism varies across moments of single-party and multi-party politics. So the data we use for this study comes from the demographic and health surveys. So these are nationally representative sample surveys collected in developing countries all around the world. They collect information about population, health, nutrition, education. We're going to focus on the education data they collect. They're conducted roughly every 5 years, and they provide quite large samples, usually about 10,000 households per country. And their sampling protocol involves enumerating collecting information about all adult females in every sampled household, and in a subset of households, also collecting information about all adult men. Quite critically for our purposes, because we want to use this information to make inferences about ethnic favoritism, DHS in most countries, including in Kenya, collect information about the ethnicity of the household head. Okay? And what's really nice about the data is that it permits an analysis of change over time. And the reason is because all of the adult household members in a given household are of different ages, anywhere from 18 to 60 years old. And so they attended primary school at different times. So for example, a 50-year-old who was surveyed in 1993 attended primary school between 1949 and 1957 when she was between 6 and 13 years old. Her sister, or her daughter, who was 30 years old in the same household, attended primary school between 1969 and 1977. And so what we do is we take all of the data from 5 DHS surveys in Kenya and pool the information we have about educational attainment of all the men and women in all of the surveyed households. And we have a sample of about 50,000 individuals, and we create age cohort-specific averages of primary school attainment. And because we have such a large sample size, and because we have information about ethnicity of the household head, we can come up with ethnic group-specific age cohorts for every educational attainment averages for every year from the 1950s up through the late 1990s. And those are the data we use to trace changes over time in educational attainment among people who are members of different ethnic groups. Okay? Okay. But the key to teasing out the ethnic favoritism component from the other group-specific components is taking advantage of changes over time in Kenya's political history in the ethnicity of the president in the country. And what we do is we compare outcomes among the president's co-ethnics during his tenure with outcomes among members of the same ethnic group during periods when they did not have a co-ethnic in power. So when Kenya got its independence in 1963, the first president was Jomo Kenyatta, who was a Kikuyu, and he was president until he died in office and was succeeded by his vice president, Daniel Arap Moi, a Kalenjin, in 1978-79. Okay? So what we can do is we can compare And then Moi was in power from 1978-79 up until 2002 when he lost an election to Mwai Kibaki, a Kikuyu. So what we can do is we can compare the educational fortunes of Kikuyu and Kalenjin during periods when they had a co-ethnic in power and when they didn't. And by doing that, we can include ethnic group fixed effects, which pick up all of the group-specific factors that provide alternative explanations for the average educational outcomes that we see in each year, and focus, by controlling for that with the ethnic group fixed effects, we can control for the impact of having a co-ethnic president. Okay? We can also take advantage of changes over time in regime type in Kenya to see whether there are differences in the patterns of ethnic favoritism we identify across moments of multi-party versus single-party politics. Okay? So this gives you a sort of schematic sketch of Kenya's post-independence history. It's not to scale, because I'm not good enough doing these things on PowerPoint to do it to scale. But Kenya started off independence as a country with multi-party elections. In 1969, there was a transition to a single-party system, then a transition back to multi-party politics in 1992. Meanwhile, you can see across the top the transitions I just described across presidents. And so what we can do is we can identify periods when each president was in power that were both single-party and multi-party, and use the variation in both the ethnicity of the president and in regime type to tease out the impact of these two different factors. Okay? Okay. We also include a bunch of other controls. We control for age cohort. That's to pick up a whole host of things, including the possibility that there's just this temporal change over time where Kenyans are becoming better educated on average. And so groups that had a president in power later might look like they were advantaged by having a president in power when in fact it's just part of a monotonic change toward higher rates of educational achievement for everyone. So the age cohort fixed effects help pick that up. We also include group-specific quadratic time trends. We have these group fixed effects in there to pick up group-specific differences, but this allows those group-specific differences to change over time at different rates across groups and for reasons that have nothing to do with having a co-ethnic president. And we cluster our standard errors appropriately. Okay, the key dependent variable in the main analysis is a very simple variable we call presidential ethnic match, which takes a value of 1 if the household member was a co-ethnic of the president at the time that he or she was in primary school. Okay? We subject that to a 2-year lag. Therefore, we don't look at ages 6 to 13, which is when people go to primary school in Kenya, but ages 4 to 11. The results, I should say, are robust to a whole series of alterations in that lag from 0 to 4 years. And small thing, if the person was in primary school during the reign of 2 presidents, we code them as we give credit to the president who was in power during the majority of their primary school years, subject to that 2-year lag. Okay? Okay. So what's the impact of having, and I apologize, this is sort of econ format in the sense that it's regression tables rather than pretty pictures, but I'll try to point you to the important parts. What's the impact of having a co-ethnic president during one's primary school years on the number of primary school years on average that you achieve? It turns out it's quite large and quite significant across a whole different set of specifications. Our estimates suggest that if there were a co-ethnic who was the president during your primary school years, you complete about a quarter of an additional year of primary schooling. That may not sound like a whole lot, but given that on average Kenyans finish only about 6 years of primary schooling, a quarter of a year is actually quite a big effect. It's equal to about a 5% increase in total years of schooling. And so we look at this where we code it, as I described, in terms of presidential ethnic match. We code it alternatively in terms of the number of your 7 primary school age years that corresponded with having a co-ethnic president. That's that second coefficient, 0.02. That's also very significant and substantively important. We look at whether having a co-ethnic president affects not just whether the number of years of primary schooling you attain, but also whether or not you complete primary schooling. Again, we find big effects. We also look at secondary schooling, which I don't show here. We find big effects. We look at a whole host of outcomes along these lines, and what we find is very, very strong, robust evidence that having a president from your ethnic group in power when you're of primary school age, controlling for a whole host of other things that we know probably also affect the number of primary school years that you complete, has a substantively and statistically significantly important impact on the number of years of schooling that you acquire. Now, one of the potential criticisms of this is, notwithstanding all of these controls and fixed effects and time trends, that maybe we still are picking up just these big long-term changes over time that happen to correspond with the fact that you had Kikuyus in power and then Kalenjin and then a shorter period that we can look at with our data where Kikuyus are back in power. And so to get at that, we do an RD analysis. This is a regression discontinuity analysis where we narrow the window where we're looking to the 3 years before and after the transition from President Kenyatta to President Moi. Okay? In that period, if we see that there is a big shift in the average number of years of primary school attendance and primary school completion among members of groups who had a co-ethnic in power before the transition and didn't after, and vice versa, then that's really strong confirmation for the causal impact of having a co-ethnic as president. And these results, which do that, we narrow the window here to this very small 6-year span, 3 years before and after the transition, suggest indeed that this finding does hold and gives us a lot more confidence in the broader results I just presented. Okay? Okay. So we have this effect. One of the problems with the analysis that I've been describing is that what we're doing is we're pooling the behavior of all presidents across all periods. And what that does is it leaves a whole bunch of really interesting questions largely unaddressed. So for example, do different presidents exhibit different degrees of co-ethnic favoritism? If you talk to people who know Kenya, some will swear that Moi is the guy who was really favoring his co-ethnics. Others will say, no, Kenyatta was. But the point is there are hypotheses we can clearly test using these data to see whether the data suggests that this degree of co-ethnic favoritism matters more under one president versus another. Okay? We can also look to see whether ethnic favoritism is driven not by the president, or not just by the president, but perhaps also by the Minister of Education, or by the broader composition of the cabinet, or by the vice president, or maybe by the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education. So part of the rationale for looking beyond the president is because leaders in Africa, as in many developing countries, use as a fundamental strategy of staying in power the practice of devolving some goods distribution authority to members of the cabinet. Very few African leaders have the luxury of being from an ethnic group that is the majority group in the country. And so to keep themselves in power, quite often the way they do it is they will make deals with political notables from other large ethnic groups, and they'll make the following sort of deal. I will give you the Ministry of X. You may use the Ministry of X as your fiefdom, as your prebend. This mode of politics is sometimes called prebendalism. I will give it to you as your fiefdom. You can use the resources that you control by virtue of being the Minister of X to do whatever you want. Keep yourself in power, keep your co-ethnics and your support coalition happy, and the quid pro quo is that when I call upon you to deliver your people to me, I expect that you'll deliver them. Okay? If that's the mode of politics that operates, then we would expect to see patterns of favoritism go beyond the president-recipient link, and perhaps there would be, in the education sector, also a link between having a co-ethnic minister. Okay? And we also might expect to see that change over time across institutional settings, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Okay. The other thing we can look at is whether regime type matters. So let's first look at this question of whether there might be some action on having a co-ethnic minister in addition to having a co-ethnic president. To test this, we collected data on the ethnic backgrounds of every minister of education in Kenya since independence and created a new ethnic match variable that takes a value of 1 if your years of primary schooling corresponded with having a co-ethnic serving as Minister of Education, subject to that 2-year lag I described. Okay? And here's what we find. We control in that first column for whether or not you have a presidential ethnic match, because we know that that's important. But if you look at this second row, the number of education minister match years, that picks up the number of your 7 years when you're primary school age that a co-ethnic occupied the Ministry of Education. And we find that to be a quite strong and large predictor of the number of years or quite strongly associated with the number of years of primary schooling that you will complete. We find no evidence that the average share of co-ethnic ministers in the cabinet more generally matters, or that the number of years in which you have a permanent secretary of education who's a co-ethnic matters. Now, quickly, let me say something about the permanent secretary non-finding. We are a little surprised about that. The rationale for looking at that is that when you actually look at the decision-making about how to allocate resources that ministries control, the minister kind of flies above it all, gives some general direction, but the day-to-day operations are run by the PS. And so we thought this might be the source of where we find the favoritism. It turns out that in every year but 2 since independence, the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education has been a co-ethnic of the president. So there's no opportunity for testing whether having a permanent secretary gives you an additional benefit, because it turns out that the permanent secretary is almost surely implementing the favoritism policies that are handed down by his boss, the president. And what's fascinating is you see when the president changes, within the next year, the permanent secretary changes from being a non-co-ethnic to a co-ethnic. Okay? And what's interesting is that in the 2 minutes, the 2 minutes, see, 5 minutes, in the 2 years in which you have a co-ethnic, where you don't have a co-ethnic permanent secretary of the president, you had a co-ethnic, the president and the minister of education were co-ethnics. Okay, just a small thing. Does regime type matter? So to test this, we introduce an indicator variable that takes a value of 1 during the multi-party periods, 0 otherwise, and we interact it with all of our other ethnic favoritism measures. And this is what we find. First of all, we find that at baseline, there's a negative impact of multi-party politics in Kenya on the average number of years of school completion, right? Which is kind of puzzling and flies in the face of a lot of the received wisdom about the impact of democracy on education and other kinds of public goods outcomes. Because we've got all sorts of time trends in there, we can rule out that this is just, we can rule out a lot of potential explanations for this. But let's leave the first column aside and focus on the other columns, where basically we find, if you look at the, does it have a pointer? Yes. No? Oh, there we go. If you, no? There we go. Okay. Is that, there we go, got it. We find, if you look at these interaction terms, we find that they're insignificant with respect to having a president as a co-ethnic, having a minister of education as a co-ethnic, but not, quite interestingly, having co-ethnics dominate the cabinet, right? We find that in a multi-party era, having co-ethnics dominating the cabinet is systematically associated with higher educational outcomes. Now, why might this be? Earlier, I talked a little bit about this notion of prebendalism, where one of the strategies for survival of political elites is to devolve power to ministers with the idea that they distribute the resources that they control by virtue of controlling the ministry as they see fit, and in return, they deliver goods, they deliver votes, okay? It turns out that we don't see an increase in that across multi-party settings, but we do see a broader increase we do see an increase in the impact of having co-ethnics in the cabinet, which is consistent with an idea that what multi-party politics does is it makes leaders need to divest power to a larger share of people in other ministries, and that's what we're picking up. That's what we're picking up here. Okay, what do we learn? There does seem to be a political component to the cross-ethnic inequality that we see in educational attainment in Kenya. Kenyans complete about a quarter more years of primary schooling if a co-ethnic is president during their primary school years. Part of this redistributive action seems to be happening at the level of the Ministry of Education, in addition to the level of the president. And critically for this audience, the transition to multi-party politics does not seem to affect the degree of ethnic favoritism we see by the president or by the minister, but it does seem to alter the role of the cabinet, which seems to play a more central role in redistributive politics. And so in one respect, a takeaway of these findings is that we want to think a little bit more deeply about the impact of democratization on the strategies that political elites play and the implications of those to stay in power, and the implications of those strategies for how distributive politics will operate in a multi-party setting.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变
改变世界。Change organization.
Change
दुनिया में
organization.
बदलाव.
Change the world.